When I wasn't home, my parents broke into my residence, lied to the police, and gave it to my brother. For background, I'm a 30-something man who is unmarried. My brother, who is 29 years old, has 4 children already, right now. He got his first at the age of 22, then his second and third a year and 2 years apart, respectively. The fourth was born a few months ago and is the most recent. We don't get along because his wife, Marcel, always acts superior to try to get a reaction out of me before becoming a dramatic, self-victimizing drama queen. She can cry instantly and put on a very convincing performance to win over almost anyone if I take any kind of revenge against her. Despite their knowledge of her true nature, my brother and dad still genuinely like her. She is really attractive, I must say. However, she is so horrible that I could never find attraction in her. Despite having a college degree, she likewise refuses to work of any kind, and my mother happily spends the entire day helping with the kids. For that reason, my brother is their only source of income. As a result, they are unable to reside anywhere other than my parents' house, which presents some privacy challenges because they are all housed together in a 1960s-era 3-bedroom home. My younger brother was also the clear favorite growing up. Although we are 3 years apart in age, he became arrogant since I would suffer severe consequences if I responded to his shenanigans in any way. When he received the majority of everything back then, it was clear that my parents loved him more. However, when other family members called him out on it, which did happen frequently, my parents packed us all up and moved us about 150 miles away from them, meaning they rarely saw us outside of holidays. My brother repeatedly physically abused me because it was a 3-hour drive. My first girlfriend laughed at my misery and ended our relationship because of his persistent flirting, and my parents would often tell me to swallow my pride when I was sad. My parents only treated me fairly when they wanted to maintain appearances. Since other people were around, I have to admit that it was amusing to watch the expressions on their faces when they had to treat me the same as my brother on holidays and birthdays. My parents tried their best to conceal the true situation and threatened to take away all of my belongings if I didn't keep quiet because we had relatives that were highly inquisitive and enjoyed speaking about drama. If anything, the fact that they were relieved of their need to support me when I turned 18 and moved out made my parents rejoice even more. Even if I hadn't finished high school when I moved out, couch surfing was still a lot better than living with them. From the moment I left home, I avoided contact. I honestly didn't care that they didn't even attend my high school graduation. After that, I would typically only spend holidays with my brother and parents along with the rest of the family. To me, the commencement of the 2020 pandemic seemed cruel. My roommate also lost their job, so neither of us could afford the condo on unemployment benefits. Therefore, I was unable to extend the lease when I lost mine. I truly cherish the 2-bedroom condo that I rented. My roommate moved back in early as the lease was about to expire, so I had to sell almost everything I owned since, if I didn't drastically reduce, I would wind up homeless. In retrospect, I should never have rented such an expensive house. However, I enjoyed living the high life until it wasn't nice to me, at which point I realized I need to have been living somewhere much more affordable in order to have more money saved for emergencies. However, I had a strategy. I put a $1,000 camper on my truck just so I could live out of it for a bit since I've always loved trucks. I had a truck for no other reason than that. I was hoping to be able to live out of the camper at my parents' house where my brother and his family still live, but I ended up living out of it for considerably longer than I had anticipated. However, my parents informed me they had a full house and didn't want me there when I begged to stay for a bit, and for the last 10 years we hadn't exactly been on good terms. They told that unless I paid them, they would only permit me to park my camper there, essentially what an apartment in my region would cost to rent. Just to park my camper, that was far too much. I was looking for a new job, so I was attempting to save as much of my unemployment benefits as I could while I was unemployed. At that rate of rent, I could as well be living in an apartment. We couldn't come to an agreement, so they labeled my camper an eyesore and instructed me to go for a hike. Despite all of this, they thought it was humorous as hell. My home had to be a camper. Along with her, my brother called me a homeless bum and pointed out and made fun of me. The first night I had nowhere else to sleep, so I parked my truck camper in a store parking lot. I was terrified someone might try to break in. It's safe to say that I had a restless night. I didn't want to just move out because I was really committed to my neighborhood. All of my friends lived in apartments, and there wasn't somewhere else I could go. My other relatives also owned houses, so they were rather far away. In addition, I had my mail forwarded to the apartment of a friend. It was my sole remaining means of receiving my letters. It was somewhat challenging to find a secure parking spot. I set out to try and locate a position that was comparable to my previous one. Months of traveling around in a camper van were required. I had a lot on my plate at that time. Beggars, drug addicts, and individuals requesting that I leave because my camper was ugly were all there. Someone once advised me to move and said they were part of a homeowners association. They were really aggressive and threatened me when I asked them what they received, even though I wasn't even parked on a street with houses. Nevertheless, I moved my camper to escape the hassle. I discovered that the best way to ensure a constant source of electricity was to recharge my camper batteries by plugging in a long extension cord wherever I could. This required driving on a street and surreptitiously connecting it into an exterior socket of any random building. I realize it's a bad idea, but in order for my refrigerator to stay cool, I had to keep my batteries charged. I didn't have anything akin to a generator, but I did have a tiny solar power bag for charging my phone. Moreover, generators need fuel and produce noise, so I took the necessary action. It took me months to find a new work, living like way every month. In order to find a career that didn't entail retail, I had to relocate to the nearby city. In college, I worked in retail, and I vowed never to do it again. Even yet, I was almost ready to break that vow. I was still receiving unemployment benefits, but I didn't want to be unemployed when they ran out because I didn't have a permanent home to live. I was also completely bored. All I could do was read, view movies on a little portable DVD player, use my laptop or phone, and make a note of the public restrooms and parking spaces I could find in the area. The existence of public baths in Japan is something I kind of envy. Things like that are exactly what we need here. I essentially lived in the building's rear lot, which was near the warehouse and the former employee parking spots, until I eventually found a new work. Since they were so deep in the back, the area was practically forgotten, and no one else seemed to bother using them. This worked well for my employer, who doubled as the owner of the company, as I was happy to work any shift I could find, provided I got enough sleep. In order for me to travel about without it, he even allowed me to remove the camper from my vehicle and set it up in one of the spots. I'm not sure if this is legal or not, but for the whole time I lived back there, no one ever harassed us about it. There weren't many intruders that I had to deal with. A handful existed, but they were let out by the security personnel. I worked almost every day of the week and was almost always available for call when they needed me. My employer allowed me to connect my camper to the building's water and electricity systems, and I made up the difference by working for free on Sundays when the janitor and security guard were the only people in the office. Beyond that, the camper only had a portable toilet and no shower, so I had to shower at my local gym or at a friend's apartment. Furthermore, I was reluctant to fill it because emptying it is a tedious task. So I took advantage of other restrooms whenever I could. I could use the warehouse restroom whenever I wanted because I had a key to it. In fact, I knew the night security man by first name. Since then, he's grown to be one of my best pals. Using a little electric heater, it was simple to heat the camper in the cold. But summers were not fun. I had to purchase a used portable air conditioner to make it pleasant because the camper lacked air conditioning. In addition to earning a lot of overtime income, I actively picked up some fresh abilities from other workers. I finally got a better job in the company as a supervisor halfway through this year, and I started getting paid more than I was at my previous job. I made the decision to house at that point. I realized I wanted something far more dependable in the long run after having the scare of losing my condo. I searched for something near my place of employment and, within 2 miles, discovered a mobile home with 3 bedrooms situated on a tiny plot of land. However, I was able to purchase it for $10,000 less than what was asked. I managed to get a house loan authorized, even though I had to utilize almost all of my funds as a down payment. I was able to move out of my camper for good. I parked the camper in the backyard as its own tiny building, just in case I wanted to use it again, as there was enough for me to reverse my vehicle and set it up there. I was foolish enough to boast about my book of faces once I had settled down completely. The real trouble started when my relatives saw the message. A few weeks later, my brother's family and my parents paid me an unexpected visit to give them a tour of my house. I withheld my address from them altogether, so I'm still not sure how they discovered my residence. I wonder whether they monitor me at work and follow me home or something, because none of my pals have come clean and no family members had paid me a visit before then. I wouldn't be surprised at all. They virtually pushed their way in like noisy tourists as soon as I opened the door, and then they just started settling in. They were all still scuttling around, and she was giving me this eerie smile all the time, and I didn't realize why until much later. And it infuriated me more than a bull doped up after being stung by a bee. My folks would not stop talking about how much extra space I had now that I don't have a wife or children, and that it's too much. Yes, that's not now, but perhaps later. There were red flags everywhere, I knew, because my brother kept saying that my house had more space than our parents and that my house was nearer to his place of employment. My brother eventually requested a private conversation. Abruptly, all the others fled the room and gathered on the front porch. That's what eventually let me recognize that they had a plan. For the sake of simplicity, I'll call my brother Dan. He claimed that since my house is much closer to his place of employment and his wife is expecting their fourth child, I should let him move in with his family because the house was too much for me alone. He made the observation that because I already own the camper, I could simply reside outside of it while they occupy the main house. Furthermore, I would want to emphasize that Dan never once mentioned renting anything. Not that he doesn't have a nice job. He also began discussing the upcoming adjustments, including curfews, and the requirement that I give advance notice before entering. I would assume the person I was speaking to had gone insane if it weren't for my brother. But our parents' treatment of Dan as though he were the center of the universe caused him to lose his marbles a long time ago. He continued talking over me when I tried to speak, acting as though I had no voice. I would never in a million years rent out my entire house to him. Others, maybe only to make it easier on myself to pay off the mortgage, but definitely not to him or his ugly wife. This similar scenario has been mentioned numerous times in internet videos, but I've never considered that I would genuinely experience it because I find it so absurd. However, my parents' brother and I still meet the description of a group of entitled, egotistical lunatics. I grabbed my phone, turned it on to record, and just gripped onto it. Dan appeared unaffected and unaware that I had done this. He simply sat there, waving his arms and explaining why he wanted my house. After he finished talking, he pretended that everything was settled and attempted to shake hands with me. That was the moment I snapped to reality and yelled, "Hell no!" And I yelled it so loudly that Dan took a brief fall backward. I had seldom ever spoken to him at that level before because every time I did, our parents would discipline me. However, I owned this house, not them. My back can be as glossy as it pleases. I got up and told them that my house was not for sale. Pretending to let him move in just because they wanted to wouldn't help. It's not my fault. I bought my house for myself. He can't afford to move out, so he has to continue living with our parents and having more children. Dan moved as close to me as he could without really touching me, telling me that his family deserved a better place to live and that I didn't deserve the house. I laughed back in his face, telling him that was all bullshit, as I had saved a lot of money for my own home. I certainly deserved it. "I may as well give it to Dan," he began to yell, "since I don't need the entire area and I don't have a wife or children." I answered, "He never even offered to pay me rent, so I'm not giving him anything. I wouldn't even be able to live in my own home if I let him come in because I would still be responsible for paying the whole mortgage." Then Dan told me that since his family comes first, he shouldn't have to pay rent, and our parents assured us that they would. I screamed like though their word were gospel or something, telling Dan that they had no authority to give my house to him in the first place, straight after slaying my parents. And still they broke through the front door and encircled me, trying to make me agree. The combat was intense. In summary, however, I heard the line, "Just do it for Dan," far more times during the battle than I can recall after that. She shouted the loudest at me about how she was pregnant again after I told them all to go before I contacted the police and that they had no say in my life or my house. And I can't do this to her. I told her I didn't hurt her. She just thought she could take advantage of me indefinitely, as if I would just go along with it. I owed her and her family nothing. I went on to label her a prickly little girl who never showed me any respect. Thus, I have no sympathy for her and don't give a damn about what she thinks or how many children she has. She is not going to reside in my home. She became so enraged by that she attacked me. After giving me a solid blow to the face, she attempted to strike me again, but my brother stopped her with a kick and scream. She persisted in her demands. He released her so she could continue to attack my eyes. I held out the phone I had recorded almost everything with, threatening to call the police if they didn't leave right now. My parents announced their departure to Dan. My mother then told me that I had a week to get my act together. I warned her not to come back and that I wouldn't be. Then I threatened to file an assault complaint against SIL if she tried anything, saying that my phone had filmed everything. She gave me a scream and stormed out, sobbing and holding her face in her hands. As she was leaving, my mother stated, "I better do this for Dan and SIL." I told her I wouldn't be in the second portion in response. I immediately went to social media and informed my family the whole incident after I threw out my brother, parents, and sister-in-law for attempting to coerce me into giving my brother possession of my new home. It spread quickly, but you can't find it now, because I made my own profile private and it was all erased a while back. I posted about it because I knew that as soon as my family returned home, they would try to fabricate a story to paint me as the bad guy. And I was entirely correct. However, I had an hour or so to get going before they did, and I could support my account of what they'd done with video evidence. Please don't ask. I won't be showing the video here. Being proactive paid off as I quickly gained the support of a sizable portion of my family. It seems like my brother, Dad, and Sil were prepared to write their own article, but they decided not to waste much time lying because it was already too late. There were a few flying monkeys to help my parents, Dan and Sael, but not many. Many others were well aware of their entitlements. It was something they all grasped and came to terms with really quickly. They specifically phoned me, one person in particular. I'm not sure who they were, but they yelled at me, calling me a bad brother who should make way for a true family man. I simply hung up and blocked the number. Nothing like this happened again. After a week, my parents arrived at my front door with Dan, just as they had promised in their previous ultimatum. They kept ringing my doorbell and banging on the door until I replied. They attempted to force their way in again when I slightly opened the door, but I put in a few latch chains to stop them and, just to be safe, braced my body up against the door. My brother and father insisted on being let inside, but I refused, telling them I would call the police if they attempted to break in again and that I was filming everything on camera. After calming them down, my mother asked me if I was ready for my brother to move in, using her sickliest possible sweet tone. I told her to screw off and never come back, along with the rest of them. My mother implored me, "Why can't I just do this for Dan because he's my beloved brother?" while shedding crocodile tears. I chuckled, and then I told him straight out that I did not love him as a brother because he had treated me badly for years, and they had simply helped him to continue. He is a bad brother, and they are terrible parents, then threatened to call the police right away if they didn't leave. With the exception of my mother's loud weeping and the others' shady eyes at me, they all went rather easily. You may claim it was strangely simple to get them to go. I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other ridiculous intentions, but I believed the whole situation was done. Later that week, on Friday night, I returned home to discover my brother's minivan and a moving truck parked in my driveway. Dan and his family were there. They're relocating within. He simply gave me a shit-eating smile and waved. When I saw him, I was infuriated and told him and his family to stop, but he smugly told me that whether I liked it or not, they were moving in. Then, in the most phony manner, she tilted her head and puckered her lips and said, "It's okay because my mommy approved of it," suggesting that I should always heed her advice. Just hearing those comments and glancing at her smug, spiteful face made me furious, and I locked myself in my truck so I could contact the police immediately. Seal began beating on my glass and screaming at me to stop because she and Dan needed the house, and she started crying when they understood what I was doing. "Could you please just do this for Dan?" I abruptly replied. "Dan, it is my house, not yours." Then she said that if I didn't stop calling the cops, she would key the side of my truck. The 911 operator heard all of them. I informed Scylla that my truck was damaged because the window was slightly open. She knew she would be sued by me, so she withdrew. Dan and Seal had locked themselves and their children in my house when the police came. I showed the police my new driver's license, which had my current address on it, and explained what had happened. Then, when we went to my front door, I noticed that they had changed the lock, and the old lock, which had had its center drilled out, was lying on the porch. The drill they had used, along with a full set of Harbor Freight drill bits, was lying right next to the old lock. I can't believe they were that stupid to leave evidence like that. I showed the police the broken drill and lock and then summarized everything that had happened before. It appears that at some point after I got home, Dan called our parents because they showed up while I was chatting with the police. My parents started lying right away, claiming that I had given my brother and his family permission to rent my house. I said that was a lie that could be proven falsely in any case. At last, Dan and SIL left my house carrying a few documents. They both appear very arrogant, as though they have managed to outwit me. My signature was missing from a fictitious rental agreement that they had actually created and printed out. One existed, but it didn't resemble my handwriting at all. It was very foolish of them because I don't think any of them have ever really seen my signature. I informed my parents, and holy cow, it was an incredibly obvious scam, and the police could easily figure that out if they looked into it, and I don't think going to jail in court would do them any good. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken, and I'd call CPS too for good measure. Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all that, but my mother got between us and doubled down about how I should just do this for Dan and live in the damn camper so they can finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house to himself. Instead, the cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now. Well, press charges, I stated in a shout about how they drilled out my front door lock to break in. The lease papers were obvious fakes. They badly forged my signature, and I have recorded video of Sil attacking me. Those are felonies. If I so desired, I could screw over their life, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's kids. They only get one chance to make amends. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they could not force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this. Then she went over to Sil and spoke with her quietly for a minute while my father spoke to Dan. Sil instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the bits of paper or he'd cite them for littering. Both of the cops at this point had the "I don't get paid enough for this" looks on their faces. Dan had to start telling his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he won't get his own room now. Sil and Dan gathered their kids up to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with the sad family routine. You know, where they all gather together in a sort of group hug while all facing one direction. I swear I think they'd practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths, still kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy. And my brother just made the saddest face he possibly could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter and told them to keep packing all the kids and still turn the crying up to 11. And Dan yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You have denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help our family." I ended up laughing like a maniac and retorting that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing, and no amount of crying will make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled prick who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me. Like when we were kids, Dan started F-bombing me till the authorities ordered him to chill it, or he'd be in cuffs regardless if I wanted to press charges. He sucked in his lips and looked a mix of terrified and immensely pissed up. I asked the cops if they could wait around until my parents, brother, and Sil had all departed, and they indicated they had no intention of going anywhere until this had been settled. In fact, in the next several minutes, 2 cops became 4 as more drove in. For whatever reason, that gave my folks some more impetus to get moving. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd installed on my front door, though I acquired another lock the next day anyway because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He was genuinely reluctant to hand them over. Then, instead of offering them to me, he actually flung them down the street and into a storm drain while suggesting to go collect them myself. But one of the cops reprimanded him for it and had him go collect them. He had to rip the grate off just to get at them, and he got fairly dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he just muttered, then slammed them down into my hand. I then instructed them everyone to go and never come back. My mother stated I'd be disowned for this, as if that were some kind of threat to me, and I voiced that to them. Then, in an extremely sarcastic glee, I said something along the lines of, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any holidays with you people where I always get treated like shit by you all anyhow, because Dan has always been your obvious favorite. You treated all me so terribly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So just suck it up as you always taught me to when I was treated badly by all of you." I said all of that, and my parents were shocked, and the 4 police officers were staring at them with a lot of judgment. I tell you, if you want to really make my unpleasant parents feel uncomfortable, Confront them in front of the police. I guarantee they won't try anything really foolish." My mother then simply began to cry and turned to go. Dan just held his children in surrender, while my father just stood there looking like he wanted to punch me. Oh, and Sil was outside on my front lawn throwing a fit. They soon organized into a line, passing out boxes and leaving my house with their belongings. Everything was removed really swiftly because nothing had been unpacked yet. However, during the process, my mother persisted in telling me that it wasn't too late and that I could still do it for Dan, trying to convince me to change my mind with each passing remark. If I let them stay, she offered to pay my rent for Dan, and if that didn't work out, she said I could move back in with them and let Dan rent my house, which would free me from having to share the building. I informed her that I didn't want Dan or his family around, so shut up and start packing boxes. After the way my parents treated me as a child, I don't want his money, and I most definitely don't want to live with him or them ever again. To me, striking a bargain with my parents would be like to doing business with the devil. Hearing that, Sil flung down a box in a fit of rage and proceeded to have a pity party on the ground, refusing to go back to living with my parents. She remained there, looking dejected and angry until the others had finished. She was unwilling to even stand up. They eventually managed to load everything onto the truck and left the house. In light of the fact that 4 police officers were nearby, all they could do was stand there and take it before they went late and talk to my parents one final time about all the crap they had made me go through as a child. For once, I confronted them about numerous instances of mistreatment and even made it clear that they were unable to simply help me, such as providing a place to stay while I was homeless and attempting to rebuild my life, or letting Dan continue to make fun of me and call me a moron. Now, who is the jerk? They intended for me to be evicted from my own home so Dan could live there for free. However, they tried to charge me more than I could afford to park my camper when I needed a place to stay after they realized I was fired. I said all of it, and the cops gave me more very critical looks. I questioned my parents, once again putting them on the spot, what I had done other than being born to deserve to be treated so poorly. They want to take what little success I have finally found for themselves by using it to benefit their favorite child, Dan, and would rather that I give everything to him and keep nothing for myself. I used the money I made to purchase my home. I owed them nothing, and I will never ask for anything from them again since I know that they will always view me as nothing more than a doormat or a cash cow. They did not respond to me. They appeared to be out of their element as they merely stood there. I asked them what in God's name made them believe they were such good parents as I carried on yelling at them. My father was red as a beet after all that, but this time he was more embarrassed than angry, and my mom was sobbing, saying what a terrible person she was. I said quite frankly that she is a terrible person. They'll all burn in hell for that too, I'm betting. They were all aware of how shy they were. However, if I had confronted them privately rather than in public about all of this, they would simply become enraged with me and continue to act as though I'm at fault. Simply put, they persisted in their denial for so long that it became ingrained in their identity. My father appeared more defeated than I had ever seen him, and my mother wept, hiding her face in his jacket. Dan and his family were packing everything back into the moving truck, and they were avoiding me like the plague. I made sure that nothing was taken from me. I was fortunate to have a couch at that time, even though I hadn't had much opportunity to acquire furniture yet. Until my brother persuaded her to take the minivan home, they all got back into their cars and continued to stand there glaring at me. And I revealed the information as soon as they were all gone by going back online. What took place? This time, my parents were too ashamed to even attempt to justify what they had done. The family was already somewhat divided prior to this occurrence, but after it happened, it was clearly in my favor. After this episode, almost my entire family has sided with me. Those that haven't, well, they just aren't siding with anyone. We did it for Dan Line, despite my parents' earlier attempts to do so. Any family support they may have had is now gone because no one would listen to them anymore. Many members of the family who I thought would not support me did. That includes the previous Flying Monkeys, so I suppose when I said I would host half the family at my new place on Christmas Eve next year, that's when they finally had enough. There was no invitation extended to my parents. Surprisingly, Sil's and my brother's profiles weren't blocked, and I noticed that Sil had given birth to her 4th child in early November. They continue to reside with my parents. Since she continued to post passive-aggressive comments about not having enough space while living with my parents every few weeks or so, I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching, probably to see if she could still guilt me. My parents aren't getting any peace and quiet in their senior years, so I'm sure it's driving them crazy. Having a newborn, my golden child brother, a mentally unstable CIL, and 3 boisterous, annoying children all living in the same house at the same time. Maybe they could set up camp in their own backyard and allow Dan to have full control of their home. That might bring them some peace. Yes, that would be possible for Dan. I'll be posting part 3 later because this post got way too long and there was supposed to be more. Part 3? I will purchase cameras when I have the money, as suggested by many of the comments made. As far as I know, nice cameras require a decent computer to record too, and I don't have anything more than a 3-year-old laptop running Windows 10. I'm still getting over my house purchase from last year. I am aware of doorbell cameras, yes. The first type of get will be that. The only reason I didn't get my brother and CIL imprisoned, according to people who insisted I should have done so because they are parents. The children depend on them, and in the event of Dan's arrest, he would probably lose his work. In the absence of that, his family would be left penniless, with a newborn, yet only a few months old. It is not necessary for them to go to jail, but you can get even without going to jail. Police are able to assist. Yes, but I got paid back without reporting anything to the police. Would I show such mercy once more? Most likely not. They are aware of it. In case anything more happened, I made the decision to hold off on creating an account and blogging until after the new year. Indeed it did. As past readers are aware, my sister-in-law, SIL, began posting plainly offensive and passive-aggressive things on social media, especially after SIL gave birth to her 4th child in November. She kept sharing the same meaningless posts repeatedly. She simply continued repeating it while coming up with semi-clever ways to phrase it. She was sick of living with my parents, complaining that there wasn't enough room for her, that she should have her own home, and so on. I realize it seems contemptuous, but if you experienced what I have with these folks, you too would be willing to play little violins in front of them in jest. They really are that awful. And as I anticipated, more occurred because I didn't create an account until January. As I previously mentioned, I invited half the family to a Christmas Eve party at my place. Despite the fact that it was a very lengthy travel for them, roughly 3 to 4 hours, everyone I invited attended to express their support. They expressed their regret for what I had gone through and gave me a lot of praise for working so hard to obtain a property on my own. When questioned why I had lived essentially homeless for so long, I had to humbly answer that I was quite attached to living here and that here was where I had the finest job chances. I should have just taken my camper and driven the 3 hours back to them. I wanted to carve out as much of a path for myself because there aren't many excellent career options in my field, if any, in my hometown. A response they largely agreed with. We then proceeded to have the nicest party I've attended in a long time. Even CDs of excellent Christmas albums were delivered by several relatives, and I must admit that my uncle's CD, including Ray Charles, was my favorite. I've never heard anyone sing Christmas tunes quite like him. It was a joyous and fantastic moment. For once, I thought I could let go of my problems from the past and simply enjoy the present. But if things had stayed that way, I would not be writing this. 2 hours or so into the celebration. Do you know who made an appearance? My brother and I tried to look happy as we popped in. They entered my front door as if they were supposed to, without even knocking. I turned off the music and yanked them out right away. They said they had gifts and pleaded to be allowed to stay. Before I had any chance to say anything, one of my uncles got up and yelled at them, telling them that after the trash they tried to pull months ago, they didn't deserve to be in my life or in my home. He was supported by a number of other relatives. To be clear, this man is the brother of my mother, and up until he learned about the drama between my parents and me, he adored her. Even though they are very elderly, my mother's parents, my grandparents, rushed to intervene and told my parents that it is way too early for them to make apologies with me. And this last year was the worst that they've ever been disappointed in them. They've long covered up their bias for my brother from prying eyes, but no one was deceived anymore. And if they ever wanted to be in my life again, they had to try really hard to treat me like a son. They then turned to face Dan and Sil, telling them they had seen the same old rubbish that Sil had been posting about. They just want it to stop already. They're sick of it. They are not moving into my house. Sil resumed her usual pattern of weeping and pontificating on how she ought to be the one residing here rather than me. She threw a fit and sat down on a chair, complaining that something wasn't fair. She has 4 children who want more space, and she just wanted a nicer location to live and feel like a genuine mom. I got this house to myself when I didn't have a family of my own. I know it was nasty of me, but I made a big deal out of telling her how bad a mother she is, letting my mother take care of the majority of the parenting while she spends her days drinking, fiddling with her phone, or blowing all of Dan's money on dates. She even has the audacity to voice her complaints. I even make the joke, which I admit went a little too far, that I'm surprised her baby doesn't get wasted from her breast milk given how much alcohol she consumes. She still demands to know if I'm labeling her a bad mother. I told her that the evidence was clear and that she should use her college degree, find employment, and learn how to save money if she wanted to be able to move out of my parents' house in the future. After her baby gets a bit older, my mother would have plenty of time because she currently watches my brother's kids for the most part. The 7-year-old son of my brother went up to me and began screaming and hitting me for yelling at his mother. He continued to tell me that his mother had told me I was the one who had made her cry and refused to allow them move in. At that point, my brother pulled his son away by grabbing him. However, my sister and brother were targeted by a family intervention as all the other relatives intervened once more. She was in tears. Her children were wailing, as was her new infant. Dan was being verbally abused to such an extent that he was almost crying. In the end, all he did was sit on the ottoman. I keep my shoes beside the entrance door, disorganized and untidy. He was unable to meet anyone's eyes. He was unable to speak to me even 2 words, not with the entire house full of irate people waiting to condemn him if he attempted to unleash his inner golden child once more. If they hadn't been there to obstruct his path, I'm sure this would have ended up looking a lot like the time he tried to boss me about to try and take my house months ago. By now, though, the masks had all come off and he had been so severely humiliated that my parents and my reputations within the family had been utterly shattered. My brother CL and Dad all left in defeat shortly after that. The celebration continued, and for the remainder of the evening, we all refrained from discussing the previous events because most of the adults had been drinking and had spent the night at my place. To ensure there was enough room, I even let a few of them to sleep in the camper. Yes, it works well as a guest house. Earlier, my relatives expressed their incredulity and wished to take a tour of it. It's been my home for almost 2 years. I was questioned about it a lot, mostly about what the summer and winter were like. I got up earlier on Christmas morning than everyone else and had some ibuprofen for those hangovers from spiked eggnog that some of them were experiencing, along with a fresh pot of coffee. I received praise for being a far better host than my parents ever were, and we all decided to repeat this Christmas season. I did, at last, stop creating posts after Christmas that were blatant jabs at me, and I also removed all of the previous ones. She did, however, only recently make a new post shortly after the new year, in which she expressed her displeasure at her attempts to get my parents to purchase a camper like I did in order to set it up in the backyard, in order for Dan and his family to occupy the entire house as their home. My parents strongly objected to the concept, so I guess it's never fun to taste one's own medication. I've heard that nobody will force them to leave their house, much less their master bedroom. She barely posted anything after Cell took down the message, which was only live for a few days. She is always complaining, but can a tree still complain if no one is present to hear it? I suppose I came to the realization that there's no use in continuing it now because no one is listening to her, and Dan won't be able to support his family on his wage alone very soon. I won't be shocked if they decide to have another child within the following 5 years. Since then, things have calmed down for me, and I've even invited friends over for a night of poker. I'm terrible at poker because I can't recall a single thing about it. But what the heck? We get to be happy fools and enjoy junk food and beer. We all gorged ourselves on Whoppers from Burger King and indulged in the ultimate way that only grown guys can when they're desperate to get wasted and have a great time. I suppose I might look into dating someone in the summer. Not that I'm growing any younger here. Let's hope everything goes smoothly. I'll admit that there have been days when I walked outside just to spend time in my camper, but now it just sits there in my yard. It was my home for 2 years. It feels like a second home, and maybe one day I'll be able to utilize it for the intended purpose of camping. No, I haven't gone camping. Since my parents thought it was a waste of time, I would have never experienced it before. This is essentially the last of the events. My brother, Dad, and Sael have all been avoiding me like the plague. They even seem to have returned to their previous behavior of treating me as if I don't exist, which predates my house purchase. Not that I'm bothered by it. Although it's preferable that way, they will unavoidably return in some capacity. They will, I'm sure of it. All I can wonder is what sort of foolish thing they will do next. If this account is still active, I'll make another post if anything noteworthy like this ever occurs again. Update. Some of the folks who commented on my earlier blogs won't be surprised by this because my parents did some of the exact things they stated they would, like seeking my money or my signature. That was probably my imagination going crazy, although I did expect the standard narcissist lines about how much I owed them, or even something along the lines of sharing the wealth, like communism. That was kind of what happened next, albeit considerably more subdued. They seemed to know not to push me too far now, I suppose, and were primarily trying to win my sympathy. It all started when my parents recently contacted me on social media and requested a meeting at a public location of my choosing. They shout "trap" loudly. I wasn't scared, though. Honestly, I found it funny. I could only wonder what they wanted, as they know that I am no longer to be messed with. This time, I chose a neighborhood eatery with a garden and an olive name, and that's where we met. Dan was among them, although for the most part he was silent. After making awkward introductions and placing drink orders, we got right to the point. Dan's parents pleaded with me to help him secure an apartment of his own so he could move out at last. Dan seems to have a bad credit history. Gee, I wonder why. Is that possible? His wife constantly puts him in debt while pleading with me to lend a hand, either financially or by co-signing the flat and contributing to the rent. I just declined both. At that point, Dan yelled at me out of rage, saying that I had everything and my family wasn't as dependent on me as his was. Since I don't have a family of my own, I should be saving the money for his family, but he required my assistance. I inquired where they were when I needed their assistance, laughing. Yes, it is correct. They were making fun of my homelessness and pointing at me. Or should we go all the way back to my early years? With so many ears to listen in on us, I'd love to get deeper into it. Grabbing my hand, my mother pleaded with me not to mention anything about it. Dan and my father simply averted their eyes and remained silent. They probably wanted to say something like, "They used to hit me," but they resisted speaking. When I informed them I didn't have that type of money, they gave me the deer in the headlights kind of expression. I asked them if they thought I was rich or anything. I talked about how much I had saved for a down payment on a house, how I had to live and work so quickly, and how much I had managed to save. And then how I used almost all of it for my house's down payment. I'm still getting my finances in order. Yes, I did have extra money coming in each month, but I was saving the majority of it. When Dan informed me his annual salary, which I had questioned him about, I pointed out that it was rather more than mine. Then I roughly calculated and split things down in front of my parents, estimating that roughly 70% of my money goes toward paying for my phone, internet, food, mortgage insurance, and other costs. And then at most, I can save up to 30% of that remaining amount. I also need to make sure I have savings as a safety net, save that money, and get back on my feet as soon as possible. My truck is a 1990s model. I would need money to replace it or fix it if it broke down. In addition, there are additional expenses such as medical bills, lawyers' fees, taxes, house repairs, and other general needs that might require a rainy day fund. For an unforeseen expense, you would require fast cash. As you can see, I simply cannot spare the cash for Dan, and I have declined to co-sign any loans because doing so would entail me bearing the responsibility for any debt that Dan is unable to pay. My mother started crying once again when I mentioned that my parents probably didn't co-sign for Dan's apartment themselves a long time ago. With everything, I was essentially one step ahead of them. I'm not a fool, nor am I an ATM, and I told them so directly to their faces. My father always gets upset with me, so I thought he would this time as well. Didn't, that is. All my life, I've known this father to blow up at me for the smallest infraction, not supporting my brother, but this time, he just didn't. Not even a sneer graced his face. I could only think of 2 words to describe his expression: sorrow and defeat. Perhaps remorse stems from being a shy dad, or from the fact he can no longer employ bullying tactics against me. Who knows? Either way, I wasn't about to offer my parents any money, so I really couldn't argue with them. Dan simply stood up and announced that he was leaving and that it had all been a waste of their time. Even after my mother began to apologize for him, Dan was still keen to go. Then, merely to murder with benevolence. While we were all there, I offered to buy them a round of unlimited soup and salad. Since we hadn't ordered anything except drinks yet, I suppose they couldn't refuse free meals, and they stayed. I made a special effort to discuss topics other than money. Dan didn't say anything and was occupied with his food or phone, but my parents engaged in an unpleasant conversation with me. They mentioned that they had only joined a local Christian church and had been attending for the last 2 weeks. I congratulated them. Naturally, they began to promote the fact that they wanted me to accompany them. All I said was, "No thanks," and they knew better than to press the issue. Dan didn't say anything to me or anybody else after the food was served, but he did leave a $10 tip on the table. After my mother simply gave her blessing to his actions, we all left. That covered it. This is still considerably better than how things used to be with my parents and brother, even though there isn't quite as much drama as I had anticipated. Regarding SIL, she seems to truly dislike not being the head of their household, even if she has been whining about my parents on the internet on a regular basis. I believe that her toxic behavior is finally affecting them. If not, why would they be so frantic to return to me? SIL is genuinely asking my parents to move into a camper, much like I did to free up space in the house, but she keeps getting told no. Though occasionally I receive messages from strangers who are angry with me for not listing my house for sale, it appears that she has a fan base of Karen-minded individuals. I no longer even try to reason with these individuals. I simply block and carry on. However, one troll in particular kept calling from a different number and had my phone number. Yes, it appears that this is the same individual that called to tell me that I should give way to Dan, a true family man, but I don't give a damn. But the calls seem to have slowed down, if not ceased altogether, since I told that person that I was the only one who found their prolonged behavior entertaining. They haven't spoken to us since the beginning of the month, when they last made a phone call.